wherever you are around the world, good morning, good evening or good afternoon. Today, we're back with another one of Nathan Bell's excellent commentary videos. Don't forget to like, subscribe, give it a share if you know someone who'd enjoy this. Today, Nate wants to talk about Kerry O'Briens, the Australian journalist's views on authoritarianism.
Yeah, well, during COVID, Kerry O'Briens came out and made some remarks about the rise of authoritarianism in Australia, and I was interested in Kerry O'Brien's remarks. It's important to note that Kerry O'Briens did think it was necessary for the military to be in the street, but he said that he felt it set a concerning precedent and that he didn't want the Australian public to become comfortable with the idea of the military being in the street and excessive police presence in the street, and that if politicians became comfortable with having the military deployed in the street and excessive police presence in the street, that was not what we wanted in this country. We don't want to live in a country where the military is deployed in the community regularly, and we don't want the Australian public to become comfortable with that. We don't really want that to be a part of our society. But a lot of people are concerned about the rise of authoritarianism in this country. And it's important to understand authoritarianism, it's a hard thing to define, but it's an attitude that sets in that people don't have the right to challenge authority. It's an attitude that sets in the minds of people in authority that they are beyond question and that nobody has the right to oppose them. And that doesn't work with democracy, because democracy is about each individual citizen's right to their own opinion and their right to challenge the opinions of others. The right to challenge is fundamental in democracy. So Kerry O'Briens said a number of remarks in his talks about authoritarianism in Australia. He was concerned about threats to freedom of press. He was referring specifically to when the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, raided the ABC around in a response to their investigation of war crimes in Afghanistan. And after that, a number of Australian journalist outlets came together and formed the Right to Know Alliance, which I support. So Kerry O'Briens made some remarks that security laws are constantly changing in Australia, and now the government has more and more access to your private data and the information of your private lives and the collection of data. A lot of people don't discuss this issue, and a lot of people don't really realise how much data the Australian government is collecting on citizens. But some of us are about this issue, and I don't agree with it. And the laws have changed in the last 20 years to allow the Australian government legally to collect data on anyone. And it's very, USSR Stalinist stuff, having files on everyone, having files on any Australian who challenges the state. And again, it's this ingrained mentality that anyone who expresses their opinion freely in opposition to government policy is a threat to security and needs to be monitored and dealt with. In democracy, we're supposed to be able to express opposition to policies of government. So when the government starts saying, we're going to monitor extensively anyone who freely expresses their opposition to government policy, this is when we move towards fascism. And Kerry O'Briens said that authoritarianism and moving towards authoritarianism moves us closer towards fascism. So he's concerned about this. It's interesting he was saying this during COVID, because he understood, as I understand, that during COVID it was an emergency global pandemic where people's lives were at risk, and it was important to maintain security and stability and to keep people safe in the community. And in situations like that, in martial law sort of situations, we do really have to trust the government to look after us, and people have to obey authority. But we don't want it to become this thing where we never have the right to challenge authority. So it's clear from Kerry O'Brien's remarks about freedom of press and threats to freedom of press from authoritarianism that Kerry O'Briens sees journalists and freedom of press and reporting as a fundamental principle of democracy. And Kerry O'Briens spoke in defence of Julian Assange, and I said these similar things in my video on Julian Assange, that journalists play a fundamental role in our society where they report on corruption, and we have to allow journalists to operate that way. They are our investigators, and they are our regulators who regulate the state to ensure that the state's kept in check. So again, authoritarian is an attitude that creeps in with people where members of government, politicians, police, military feel they are beyond question and that nobody has the right to keep them in check. But in democracy, power is supposed to be with the people, and the people are supposed to have the ability to regulate the state to ensure that everything's being done properly, as I said in my video on Julian Assange. So it was interesting to see a prominent speaker like Kerry O'Brien come out and express concerns that Australia is moving towards an authoritarian culture. And, you know, it gives he's viewed as an intelligent speaker in our society and a credible journalist. So if he feels that way, then we can take that view seriously. Some people say if you think Australia's moving towards fascism, you're a conspiracy theorist. But Kerry O'Brien's remarks show that credible thinkers feel that Australia is moving this way. And again, you know, it's that government surveillance that really bothers me, the government having files on everyone and keeping everyone's data. And Australians don't really understand security law in this nation, and some of the laws that have been brought in around collecting data on citizens and invading our privacy. But it's clear that the view of the security community is that people have an obligation to be transparent and to let everyone see everything about themselves. And it's that attitude of if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't have anything to hide. So it's clear that, and Kerry O'Brien also, and I read the article in the Sydney Morning Herald about this as a refresher this morning. I remember it when Kerry O'Brien came out and said these things during COVID, and I just did a refresher this morning. And Kerry O'Brien, he did talk about the security policy and the invasions of people's privacies and the erosion of civil liberties over the last 20 years. And he said that, as he said, security policy continues to change and continues to become more strict. And so it's clear that he believes in civil liberties. And I do think something is happening in this country where we're losing respect for civil liberties and people's rights to challenge each other and to challenge the state and to speak freely about their views. So Kerry O'Brien's clearly very big on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and particularly freedom of journalism. And he feels that civil liberties have been eroded over the last 20 years and that the changes in security policy are bad. But the Australian government would obviously, and both sides, both of the major parties seem to maintain that people have an obligation, a social responsibility to accept these changes to security policy, which mean that the government can monitor anyone they want and collect data on everyone and invade everyone's privacy, and that Australians don't have a right to privacy. We have an obligation to be transparent. That is the view of ASIO and ACES and the security community. And that is the view of policymakers who are making these security policies. So we don't have to agree with that. This is a democracy, and we are supposed to be deciding the policies. In my democracy, in my direct democracy, Australian citizens create policies which are proposed to the forums, you know. So we have a right to oppose these policies, but there is an attitude coming in this country that policy is beyond question and the authority of formal politicians and decision makers and lawmakers is beyond question, and that individuals in the community don't have the right to call in to challenge any decision made by an employee or representative of the government, and that's undemocratic. So we see from Kerry O'Brien's talk about this subject that credible thinkers who are respected in this country in the political sphere feel this way, and I wonder who else feels this way. I certainly feel we have lost a respect for individual liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the right to oppose the state. And we're being told more and more that we must accept and that we have no right to challenge. And again, you know, Julian Assange is a good example of this, even though that's relevant to the actions of the American government. But the Australian government obviously is in line with that because they won't do anything to support Assange. So it's this mentality that is creeping in the establishment in our country that they are beyond question. Now, so we're supposed to be a democracy where the people are in charge, and that is... The democracy is supposed to put the people in charge of the country, and we are supposed to be able to regulate the state for corruption. So we can't have this mentality where members of the government are beyond question and where policy is beyond criticism. So go and look at what Kerry O'Briens said about this subject and recognise that credible thinkers in Australia feel that authoritarianism is creeping in this country and that we need to protect freedom of press and the right to challenge. And drop a comment in the comment section about what you think about authoritarianism in Australia.